current laws and regulatory frameworks and how they're affecting forests. And I please call Joe Bragg from the Environmental Defenders Office in Queensland.
Thank you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional elders and custodians of the land on which we meet. I'd like to greet the Tribunal members and say hello to all the people who've come along today to participate and discuss these very important issues. So as mentioned, I'm a solicitor at Environmental Defenders Queensland, so my experience over quite actually more than 20 years is looking at environmental laws, assisting people with advice on how to use the laws that we have, but also very much being conscious of the deficiencies, the problems, the ways in which the laws desperately need to be improved. So I was asked to briefly outline what are the laws that we have today, like what are in force in the state and federal mainstream parliaments that are designed to protect our forests. Now, one law that was mentioned by several of the witnesses was the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. That's the main federal law that we have that's meant to look after our environment. Now, as mentioned, there is a huge exemption in that legislation where a regional forest agreement has been reached. If there's a regional forest agreement reached in relation to particular areas of forest, then the assessment process under that Act doesn't apply. And there was a particular case, Wylangta Forest, where Bob Brown took action in the federal court saying that while there was a regional forest agreement, it didn't comply properly with the requirements to be a valid one, and therefore there was destruction of endangered species, the wedge-tailed eagle, the broad-toothed stag beetle and the swift parrot. And because the regional forest agreement was not valid, this action, this logging action, was in fact breaching that federal law. So at first instance, Senator Bob Brown did win in the federal court relating to that destruction, but unfortunately on appeal he then lost his case. So that's a particular problem area of the current law, and a colleague, Tom Baxter, from Tasmania, if we have time, can give a lot more detail about that particular problem. I should also mention that the Commonwealth law, it does not effectively protect forest. It provides triggers and assessment processes for particular actions that might lead to a refusal of those particular actions that will destroy forests, or it might lead to conditions being attached. It doesn't in any solid or positive way clearly and unambiguously protect our valuable forests. It has World Heritage as a matter of national environmental significance. It has endangered communities, Ramsar wetlands, but these are all triggers. They don't of themselves actually protect our precious forests. In relation to other legislation that's designed to protect forests, our nature conservation legislation is meant to protect some of our forests. In Queensland, it's the Nature Conservation Act, and other states have their own nature conservation legislation. Unfortunately, these acts, as we know, do not effectively protect the majority of our forests either. The highest level of protection you can get in Queensland is national park. In a national park, you can't have mining, but that's a very small percentage of our state, and unfortunately that can be reversed if Parliament wants some destructive use of that park. It's possible to reverse it. We do have forestry legislation, and to my surprise, I looked it up this morning to check it hadn't changed. We're still operating under the Forestry Act 1959.
Shame.
And that act is all about exploiting forests and selling the timber. It in no way seeks to protect our forests. Dr. Martin Taylor mentioned that Queensland vegetation protection legislation has become very weak with those self-assessable codes. We no longer have an exclusion of high-value agriculture taken out of the purposes for which the vegetation can be cleared. So that's a grave problem for our Queensland forests. And I think it's also important to note that in relation to mining, on private conservation areas like the Bimblebox Nature Refuge, for example, even though it's a protected area under the Queensland Nature Conservation Act, it is not protected against mining. So that just shows how our current laws don't effectively protect our forests and communities. Now, I will also refer to, of course, native title. It's absolutely true. It does not protect our forests or those for all their natural values, their cultural values. It's a negotiation pathway, but it contains no guarantee of protection. So that's probably a very broad, big picture outline of the law. And in most states of Australia, you have similar laws to the ones I described for Queensland. Really quite a weak system in terms of protecting forests.
Can you tell us, in your view, have you got an opinion on how the laws need to be changed or what needs to be improved?
Well, I think fundamentally we need legislation that prescriptively protects our forests, and I think through discussion with our First Nation people, with our communities, with our conservationists, with our scientists, we know the areas that should be protected and the forests that need to be protected. We can pass legislation that actually protects these areas as opposed to merely having assessment processes that inevitably are developer biased and lead to the developments going ahead anyway. So we need prescriptive provisions in our legislation, but we also need a political system where the community is effectively represented by politicians who value protection of our forests and don't degrade the laws if we manage to get them through. So that's a very broad answer. But by and large, that's what we need, prescriptive provisions. Now, we have, I think, 2 minutes left. I just saw a sign, and I wonder if I could invite Tom Baxter from Tasmania to talk specifically about the Commonwealth legislation and regional forest agreement.
Fabulous improvisation.
Thank you very much,
Drawing on
Jo.
the resource. Yes.
And yes, my name is Dr. Tom Baxter. I'm a lecturer at the University of Tasmania, where our forests are home to some of these endangered species. And I might need to just ask you to click me if that's okay. As well as containing their cultural landscapes as well, where Aboriginal people lived through the last ice age. You will know about the Tasmanian devil, not the Disney version, but these are our wedge-tailed eagle, the quoll. You know from the High Court decision in the Franklin Dam case that the federal government has the power to pass laws to implement the treaty obligations to which Australia has signed up. Thanks. It's done that, next slide, through the EPBC Act, which has been mentioned. Those are its objects, including to implement our international treaty obligations. Next slide, thanks. And there are those matters of national environmental significance, which the federal government has now limited its environmental laws to. Next slide, thank you. This is the RFA exemption, or one of them, in the EPBC Act. Essentially what it's saying is if you're in one of those coloured areas, those are regional forest agreement regions, they're places where the state and federal government have made an agreement, basically just a contract between two governments, and all commercial forestry in those areas is exempt from our one national environmental statute, the EPBC Act. Thanks. Which means that places like this in the Florentine Valley, which has Aboriginal caves, stencils on the walls, last known habitat of the last known Tasmanian tiger. Next slide, thanks. Can be subject or have been subject to strategic roading like this in the past by the state-owned Forestry Tasmania. And this is one of the problems with leaving forestry regulation to the states. There's an inherent conflict given that they generally own the state-owned forestry corporations. forestry in the northeast highlands of Tasmania. Next slide. This is essentially clear, fell, burn and sow forestry. You clear the landscape and then you firebomb it, napalm style, in that lower depth, because the idea in southeast forests is to get rid of the long-lived rainforest species and replace them with eucalypts, for which you need a hot burn such as these. Next slide, thanks. That obviously has climate implications. That's a map of one day of the so-called forestry regeneration burns across Tasmania. It's our largest greenhouse emission in the state. Next slide, thanks. And then you go through and, as has been mentioned, plant, if you like, those monocultures that were mentioned before. It's a form of regulatory capture. The industry, effectively, governments have drafted this exemption in the interest of the industry rather than public interest. Next slide. Wildlife impacts, poisoning of native animals, animal welfare issues was mentioned earlier when they try to eat your juicy young seedlings. Next slide, please. And yes, as a result of impacts on wildlife such as the federally listed endangered wedge-tailed eagle, next slide, the swift parrot, which Joe mentioned, that migrates up the east coast of Tasmania to the mainland, next slide. Bob Brown went to court, and to cut a very long story short, he obtained a judgment that Forestry Tasmania's operations in the Wielangta forest were so bad, not only were they posing a significant impact on federally listed endangered species, the wedge-tailed eagle, the swift parrot and this Wielangta stag beetle, they were so bad they even breached a clause of the Tasmanian Regional Forest Agreement in which Tasmania had agreed to protect federally listed endangered species. So Bob won that case at trial. What John Howard then did with the Tasmanian Premier was to agree to change that critical wording in the Regional Forest Agreement. And they changed the words in which Tasmania had agreed to protect endangered species, and they replaced it. Clause 68 now says, in essence, the state and Commonwealth agree that these endangered species are protected by a reserve system, which doesn't really help you if you're a species outside the reserves. Because of that legal fiction, when Bob eventually got to the High Court, they said, sorry, the goalposts have shifted partway through your litigation. The governments have agreed endangered species are protected. So we as a court can't look behind that. And that's why we need a tribunal such as this to consider not just that procedural legal fiction, but the actual substance of what's occurring. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time for a couple of questions and then we'll turn back to Lauren to close. And we're running very beautifully on time, perhaps with just a few minutes to spare, a few minutes over. So I'd like to start, if I may, I'd like to ask you guys some very simple questions. And I'm not grilling you, I'm just trying to clarify the insanity of our current legal system, if I may. So you can either nod or say yes or no, they're pretty simple questions. So is it correct that right now, we live in a federal system? We have the top layer is so-called federal or Australian government. The next layer is the state government. And all around Australia, we have different laws at the state level. So here's the yes or no question. So right now at the federal level, we don't seem to have any laws actually imposing a positive obligation or a positive ethical responsibility on this country to protect, care for forests.
That's correct. The federal government has washed its hands, Pontius Pilate-like, left forestry regulation to the conflicted states.
Okay.
One of the problems with that is it leaves the federal government devoid of power to ensure its international treaty obligations, World Heritage Convention, Biodiversity Convention, are upheld. Do you trust your state government to uphold those international treaties?
Okay, no. So, okay, thank you. So right at the moment, our federal government is not really imposing any positive obligation to care for or manage our forests. And at the state government level, I know it's complicated, but I'm just trying to simplify it. We also almost have no positive obligation to care for, protect, or recognise the living entities of these amazing forest ecosystems.
The only way that's really being done is when forests are moved into protected area status. So we did have a South East Queensland Regional Forest Agreement that was negotiated some years ago, and there was a process whereby some forests were to be moved through to protected area status. That got interrupted under the previous government, and many properties have never made it to the protected status. So really, it's all about getting forests moved to protected area status, of which the only one where they're protected from mining is National Park.
Okay, and that's actually all I wanted to hear, was just the simplicity. The complexity as we delve down into it seems to be the nuances of how quickly we can cut it all down. To me, the significant lack of a positive obligation on our people, white fellas in that system. I know that First Nations people have got this ancient law and they know to protect, and I know that we all know this, but I'm still amazed that our legal system works that way. So that's the end of my questions.
Just possibly preempting your question, but I'm still interested in this peculiarity of the RFA exemption in the EPBC Act and where it came from and its genesis. And is it a peculiar incident of federalism? And it also seems to me from what you just said that the RFA exemption itself seems to undermine the objects and purposes of the Act if the federal government is then kind of unable to uphold its obligations internationally, etc.
Yeah, my PhD on this topic argues it puts Australia in breach of some of its federal international treaty obligations. I should add that forestry is also, they're the only industry with this broader scale exemption from the EPBC Act. They're also exempt from our export control laws because the feds decided they didn't want to have to deal with woodchip export licences anymore. That was part of what happened around the time the EPBC Act was brought in. It is true there is state-based regulation. In Tasmania we have a forest practices system. 2 points that exemplify that. It has in the objects of the system, the Forest Practices Code, the object is self-regulation. So industry effectively, their own people certify their own compliance with forest practices. The newly appointed head of Tasmania's Forest Practices Authority, the top of the tree when it comes to regulating forestry in Tasmania, his previous job was as the advisor to Liberal Senator Richard Colbeck, who spent his past few years trying to argue for winebacks of the World Heritage listing.
Did others on the panel have any questions or comments? Brendan, did you have any questions or comments? No?
Could I just ask,
yes, please.
Could I ask a silly question?
No, no such thing.
About law, but can somebody sue somebody? I mean, can they be sued? I mean, although I know, I mean, from a legal point of view, we're still dealing in the Western legal thing, but is it possible? I mean,
Back one slide.
is that a...
People can be, there is the scope and lots of people have tried legal action. I guess my point is if someone like Bob Brown, with all the publicity that he could bring to his case, if he still gets treated the way in which the governments did blatantly, Justice Kirby made all sorts of comments about the appalling nature of doing this midstream litigation. If litigation with that public profile is dismissed by governments this way, imagine what happens to all the other forestry cases, perhaps without quite such a public profile.
Thank you. Sorry, Joe, did you have a comment? Or?
Well, I would like to refer to some examples Dr. Martin Taylor mentioned. Dr. Taylor mentioned there'd been a lot of clearing in Queensland of forest that had federally listed threatened species and communities. If an action is taken, such as clearing, that's likely to have a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance, like listed threatened species, World Heritage, then that action is illegal unless a permit is obtained. So ideally our governments take action to see our Commonwealth environmental laws are enforced in those sort of cases. The community does have legal rights to go to court to see environmentally protective laws are enforced, but obviously that's a huge investment of time, resources and energy, and it is only sparingly done.
Thank you, and it's exactly as Brendan said before, the burden of proof is always on the people trying to care. Okay, one more question from Brendan and we're going to wrap up.
This is just this issue of the Commonwealth government's responsibilities for Australia's native forests. and there's constitutional constraints here. And previous witness Martin mentioned this instrument called a Heads of Agreement, Environmental Heads of Agreement, as being the mechanism that needs to be changed. Is that the only avenue here? I mean, are the constitutional constraints on the Commonwealth so large or impervious that that's the only scope we have to have the Commonwealth government assume some greater responsibility?
No, they're not. There are no longer any effective constitutional restraints on the Commonwealth apart from the external affairs and its treaty powers. The High Court's acknowledged that the Commonwealth has pretty much plenary power to regulate corporations, and most forestry is undertaken by companies in one form or another. So the Commonwealth can regulate to the extent they wish. It's a political decision that they don't want to be involved in these politically messy disputes. Hence, they've taken a back seat, left it to the conflicted states, resulting in the breaches of our international treaty obligations.
Okay, on that note, we will thank you very much and hand back to Lauren. Thank you so much.
Tribunal, thank you for hearing our matter here today. We're asking you to bear witness to our concerns, what's been presented here as part of the forest's case, and to make a statement reflecting our claims. Very specifically, we are demanding that the government, both federal and state and broader Australian community, enable First Nations people to lead in forest governance decisions. We consider, secondly, that the wholesale devastation that we have seen and continue to see of native forest communities does amount to ecocide. Thirdly, that in accordance with the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, the rights of the forest to exist and thrive and to evolve have absolutely been violated, and we must take restorative action to enable our forest communities to regenerate. So we must immediately act to create rights of nature laws for Australia's forests to recognise their own rights as living entities, and also that we will act to advise the federal and state governments about the failure of the existing legal system to protect the health of our forests, and the immediate law reform that must take place to abolish regional forest agreements and to act to protect native forests. And we will advise them about a new legal approach to protecting forest communities. On behalf of forest communities in Australia and the people who presented here today, we ask the Tribunal to accept this case for further deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you.